Today is October 5th, 2016. I am local historian Tom Arnold, interviewing Fred Six at the Lawrence Public Library for the City of Lawrence Fair Housing Ordinance 50th Anniversary Oral History Project. At the time the ordinance passed in July 1967, Justice Six was serving as the Secretary of the Lawrence Human Relations Commission. Justice Six, let's start by having you tell me a bit about your early background, including what brought you to Lawrence and what you were doing here in the mid-1960s.
What brought me to Lawrence was my mother and my father. I moved here, my family moved here when I was 5 years old. My dad had been principal of the Vinland High School. Vinland had a high school then. He was principal, football coach, janitor, math teacher, vocational ag teacher. And a position opened up as the county extension agent, county farm agent. And he applied for the position and was hired. And we moved from Vinland to Lawrence into the 1700 block on Mississippi Street, just south of the campus. And made one more move next door. My parents purchased a home at 1732 Mississippi Street. And I resided there until all through high school, college, and I graduated from KU in 1951. Then the Korean War was on. All of us who were male and able-bodied were required to register for the draft. And the Korean War had been declared 1950 in the summer. So in April of my graduation year, along with many other young men all over America, I had orders to report for active duty. And I was in a Marine Corps program while in college. And so that packet arrived around Easter, and it was keyed to graduation. And upon graduation, you were commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps and given a set of orders to report to Quantico, Virginia at a certain date. And of course I took that seriously and was in the Marine Corps for a period of 2 years, and then returned to Lawrence from Korea. I was a little late. It was in the summer 1953, and law school here had started, so I arrived back in Kansas City. The flight was from Japan to Wake Island to Hawaii, a couple of days in Hawaii and the Barbers Point Naval Air Station, waiting to be manifest back to San Francisco to Treasure Island. And then from Treasure Island, we were released, and I flew to Kansas City and reported into the law school maybe a week or so after the summer term had started. And lived with my parents' home while going to law school. Actually walked up from 1700 block on Mississippi Street to Old Green Hall. And on graduation from law school, I took a position with a firm in New York City, and I was there and shortly returned to Kansas, to Topeka. And I was an assistant attorney general. John Anderson Jr. was the attorney general who hired me. and he became governor in 1960 and served. The governor then had 2-year terms rather than 4, and he was elected for 2-year terms. In 1958, I returned to Lawrence as an associate with the firm of Asher and Ellsworth, and then became a partner. In 1960, the Ellsworth of the firm, which was Robert F. Ellsworth, was elected to the United States Congress. His father was Fred Ellsworth, after whom Ellsworth Hall is named at the university. Fred Ellsworth was a long-time beloved alumni secretary at the university. So Bob then went off to Washington with his family, and I was left as a single practitioner. And I knew I didn't want to practice law alone. I just wasn't smart enough to handle the development of the law in the way I thought it ought to be practiced as an individual. And Richard A. Barber was a man I admired. His office was down the hall from right over Starbucks. Now it was the old Lawrence National Bank building. And so I walked down the hall and asked Dick Barber if he'd hire me. He'd already hired a close friend of mine, John Emerson. And he said yes. And so Emerson and I were associates of Barber. And then shortly, maybe 1962 or so, the firm Barber Emerson and Six was formed. The firm is now known as Barber Emerson and has a lovely office off South Park on Massachusetts Street. So we practiced law in the bank and then moved into the new building we built. And I practiced law here in Lawrence until 1987, when I was appointed by Governor Mike Hayden to the Kansas Court of Appeals. And then a year later, Governor Hayden appointed me to the Kansas Supreme Court. And I served on that court until the mandatory retirement. Under Kansas law at that time, a judge had to retire at age 70, or if you were within the middle of your term, because the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals were merit selection positions. And so you went before a committee winnowed it out, submitted 3 names to the governor. The governor made a choice. So I reached age 70 in the middle of my 6-year term, and I was permitted to serve until 2003, and then by statute, I was mandatorily retired. And that brings us up to 2003, and we're now 2016. So I have been here in Lawrence again and lived in Lawrence all the time I worked in Topeka, commuted actually on the bypass, went in about the time I was commuting, and that worked out well. And that brings us up to the Lawrence connection that you asked about. Right. And except for the Marine Corps time in Cherry Point, North Carolina, Washington, D.C., and Korea, and then working in New York City, why I've been here in Lawrence.
So you truly are a lifelong Lawrencian.
Yes.
Was it something that you experienced in the Marine Corps that influenced you to pursue a career in law, or was that something you knew you wanted to do even before you went into the Marines?
The Marine Corps had just a tangential influence. When I was in Korea, I was assigned to a United Nations unit in the China Sea. You may recall that one day the Russian representative at the UN on the Security Council was in a tiff and left. And that's when the resolution was passed to intervene in the Korean conflict. So it became a UN operation. And there was a British operation in the China Sea in which there was one American aircraft carrier, one British carrier. And the destroyers or frigates that formed the screen, fore and aft, port and starboard, were from New Zealand, Canada, the United Kingdom, U.S. And I was in the squadron. There was a Marine squadron on the United States carrier. And in that squadron was a fellow who'd gone to law school at Washington University in St. Louis. And he talked to me as we got acquainted. He'd been recalled for the Korean War. But I think what really influenced me, I didn't have any lawyers in my family, no law background, but the dean of the law school, Dean Fred Moreau, had run into my mother down on Massachusetts Street. And my mother was a talkative woman, proud of her son, so you didn't need to ask about me, she'd talk. And Dean Moreau wrote me a personal letter. Nobody had ever written me a personal letter before, asking me to come to law school. And I kept that letter with me, and I'd read it over and over again. It taught me a number of things. One, the sweet nature of a personal written communication, saying we'd like you to come see us, or thank you, or that outreach. So when I returned, I went up and talked to the dean, and he enrolled me.
Great. Well, let's move on to your experience as a member of the Human Relations Commission and what Lawrence was like in that time frame. To start with, how did you become a member of the Human Relations Commission? And I think it was in 1964.
The mayor of Lawrence then was Jim Owens. And he called me one day at the office and asked me if I would fill a position that was vacant. And he told me a little bit about the commission. Told me who was on it then, and I knew the names. Petey Cerf, anybody who lived in Lawrence in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, knew of her. She had a remarkable influence on the community. The chairman was Dr. William Binns, who happened to be a neighbor of where I lived. He was affiliated with KU. And others then on the commission that I knew. So I said yes and joined the commission when the then secretary, Mrs. Eugene Wallace, became chairman of the commission. Then I was, by the commission members, asked to be the secretary. So I was the secretary through 65, 66, 67, on into probably 68. I don't even remember exactly when I went off the commission, but it maybe was 68, 69.
Okay. Before getting into any of the specifics of your work on the Human Relations Commission, I'd like to have you describe to me, as best you can recall, what the city was like at the time, particularly in terms of the racial climate and obvious elements of segregation or discrimination. And was that something that you recognized at the time and helped kind of motivate you to want to become a member of the commission to try and address those issues?
Yes. The city had gone through a historical period in let me think, the time of the Troubles. There was racial unrest throughout the country. I can't specifically pin the dates on Watts in Los Angeles, but Lawrence had in 1964, when Jim Owens called me, Lawrence had no public swimming pool. It had a private pool called the Jayhawk Plunge that was out off 6th Street. And I knew it well because when I was a small boy, being white, I was entitled to swim there. And my mother would prepare a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and give me a nickel for a bottle of neon orange pop. And I'd get on the bus, public bus, the corner of Mississippi and 17th, ride down to where the First National Bank was, which is now Merchant's Restaurant, ask for a transfer to a bus that would let me off at Michigan and 6th Street and walk up to the swimming pool, reverse it on the way home. So a group of faculty members at the university had sensed the inequality, the discomfort of this situation. And there was unrest at the university as well. Employment was surfacing, the lack of opportunity for employment. And of course, housing was merely one of many discriminatory practices. More prominent, at least to me as a white person, was the public accommodations for eating and restaurants. The Civil Rights Act was adopted in 1964 and signed by President Lyndon Johnson. But the Lawrence theaters were segregated. The Granada Theater, which is still there, a venue for rock bands and others, had phosphorescent rims on the last couple of rows that would glow in the dark, and that's where African Americans were to sit. At the Pattee Theater, which is no longer existent, but is the arcade on Massachusetts Street on the east side, in the block between 8th Street and 7th Street. You had to sit in the balcony if you were African American. And the same was true in the Jayhawker Theater, which is now Liberty Hall. And so as an adult with a wife and 2 small children, in 1964, I'd come back to the community and my eyes were opened, not as broadly as they should have been. But I began to talk to myself and say, where was I when I was a teenager? I went to Lawrence High School. Blacks couldn't play basketball. They had their own basketball league. They couldn't play football. They could run track. Where was I? I was president of the student council at Lawrence High School. What did I do? I didn't protest. I didn't hold it. I mean, I was oblivious to all of this. And I remember my mother, who sort of started the theater in Lawrence, had children's theater, and she had annual plays, which were performed in the high school auditorium. And she began to outreach for African American children to bring them into the plays. So in 1964, when Jim Owens made the call, I thought this is something that I can do. During the Monday night questioning period, the city attorney, Tony Wheeler, asked a question of me if I'd felt any pushback in working on the ordinance. And I said, no, I hadn't. Maybe there were some people who didn't retain me as an attorney because they were of another persuasion. I don't know about that. But I do know, apropos to that question, that I felt at the time my family were rooted in the community. And I know this is the way that Ship Winter felt, who was on the Human Relations Commission, and Glenn Kappelman felt, because both of them had grown up in Lawrence.
Right. I was going to get to that question later, but since you brought it up, let me elaborate a little bit on the pushback issue. Were the members of the commission concerned at all when you all took up the issue of developing a fair housing ordinance? Did you think you might get pushback from elements of the community other than obviously the real estate industry?
We were aware that it was a hot button issue, but we had, I think, a sense that the city, through the mayor, Dick Rainey, and some of the other commissioners and the city staff, were hoping that we would be the point people and that it would move forward. And I didn't have anything but support from my two law partners then. I didn't even think about asking them. I just said yes and told them that I was going to be on this, and that was fine. But the reputation of the commission was known to me when I looked at who was on it. And then there was some turnover, and the members of the commission that actually were involved with the ordinance were Chairman Mrs. Wallace, Mrs. Skipper Williams, Jan Williams, Dorothy Keltz, Mrs. Hal Keltz, Reverend Norman Steffen of the University Lutheran Church, which was new. It was out on Bob Billings Parkway and Iowa. And Glenn Kappelman. Jim Owens had just been the mayor, and he came to the commission. And he had the Owens Flower Shop down on 9th Street and was prominent. And I think moving from the City Commission down to the Human Relations Commission added some gravitas to the makeup of the Human Relations Commission. John Spearman, an African American who was well thought of, was also on the commission. And the group, as a group, commission members worked well together. Mrs. Skipper Williams and her husband, Skipper Williams, who founded, along with his brother Odd Williams, the Williams Fund at KU, which has taken on a significant role in the KU athletic programs, would, I recall a couple of occasions where they would have social functions in their home and invite African Americans, including Homer Floyd, who was the state civil rights director. And Homer Floyd was known in this community because he'd been recruited from the East as a football star. And so the name Homer Floyd was, and he'd gone on and received, I think, a master's degree and had come back to Kansas. He was just a charming individual, and I think he was then offered a position maybe in Pennsylvania as the director of their civil rights program.
Yes, and he's still in Pennsylvania. In fact, I'm going to be interviewing him around Thanksgiving when I'm back on the East Coast. I'm looking forward to that.
Yes.
He, I think, played a very important role not only in Lawrence but for the state of Kansas.
Yes, and regrettably his efforts, the legislature didn't go along with the state. We were hopeful that in March of 1967, the state would adopt a state open housing law. There'd been a committee, legislative committee, studying it, and the committee recommended adoption. And when that was turned down, our commission wanted to move forward with deliberate speed because there would be no state law.
Right. So clearly you feel that having, as members of the Human Relations Commission, kind of a diverse group of fairly prominent, well-respected people gave them a degree of credibility that they could take on kind of more controversial issues that...
Yes, definitely, because the business community, I mean, Ship Winter's father, Ship Winter Sr., had been in the community since the 1930s. And in fact, his grandson, Ship Wentwinter Jr., is the CEO of People's Bank and was a state senator from Lawrence in this geographical area and has been a leader in this community. So and then when Jim Owens joined the commission, yes, I think that had a substantial effect.
Right. There was an observation made, and I think it was by George Caldwell, who I think was involved with the League for the Promotion of Democracy, but in 1963-64 he wrote that he thought that in its earliest period of existence that the Human Relations Commission was viewed by some as being a little bit disappointing in what they were able to accomplish, and he described as because of only grudging acceptance of their role by the city commission. Do you have any sense that there's, and that they therefore had to kind of build up rapport and a degree of credibility before they could take on more difficult issues? Do you think that's a fair assessment? Would you have seen it that way, or is it difficult for you to say?
I don't know the name George Caldwell. I don't recall it. I may have met him. But in reviewing the materials, my correspondence, I noticed that in 1965, I think, I wrote a letter as secretary of the commission to Ray Wells, the city manager, indicating that the commission was interested in a series of questions concerning opportunity in Lawrence, and one of them was housing. But I was writing him as chair of a subcommittee on employment opportunities. And I was asking on behalf of the commission for the city's employment records on minority employment. In 1964, Dr. William Benz, chairman of the commission, wrote the mayor and the city commission outlining a whole series, housing, education, employment, that we were headed into, that we were looking into. I had not any experience with the commission before being asked to join. I never appeared before it, nor in my law practice did I have occasion to be involved with it in any way, or in my capacity just as a citizen. One of the things we did do as a commission on the swimming pool issue, finally the Jayhawk Plunge owner, was privately owned, shut it down because there were pickets to open it up to everyone. But it was a private business, so it was closed. And that left no pool at all. But in Lawrence then were four brothers, known as the Moore brothers. They all grew up in Lawrence. Bud Moore, Al Moore, Mark Moore. Mark just died, I think earlier this year, or Bob Moore. Mark Moore, his brother, died many years ago. Bob Moore turned out to be quite a builder, and his son is still active in the community, I think chair of the library board, or has been. But they were builders of houses, and they would put, they had built a kind of a private club out where Freddy's is at 23rd Street and Iowa. And there was a pool there. And so our commission, it was really a kind of a push that we wanted to get something open that the public could go to. And the Moore brothers stepped forward, just a total voluntary act on their own. They didn't ask for any money. And this was a small pool, but they opened it up to the public. And the city, as I recall, furnished a lifeguard, or came up with some money for a lifeguard. And I think there was some negotiation probably with the city attorney on liability issues covering the Moore brothers who owned the pool, or one of their corporations. So that was a bit like a lid on a tea kettle. I mean, there was a feeling that, a city like Lawrence, I mean, what city doesn't have a public swimming pool? Garden City, Leavenworth, I mean, on and on. Probably even Baldwin City had one, or Eudora, I don't remember. But that was an act that I applauded as an individual, and we as a commission. And then we started working with the city on planning. It was primarily the city's responsibility. And there was a recreational fund bond opportunity, and eventually the city acquired its swimming pool.
Right. Obviously, with the city doing that, with the fair housing ordinance being passed, and then with some individual actions like you just described with the Moore brothers, people were stepping up and taking action. But what's your sense of, in the years leading up to that, what were the main impediments to bringing about change and starting to address some of the discriminatory actions?
The the public schools here had no segregation, except in the history there was a black grade school called Lincoln School in North Lawrence. And so the public schools were open, but it was the historical carryover from the days of national segregation. Lawrence and Kansas talks about the Free State. We have a high school. We have a popular restaurant, brewery, Free State. But actually, Kansas wasn't a haven for a Negro or for an African American. You could not be a slave here, but what opportunities did you have? And segregation was right under the surface. And there was always this call in the background of the New Englander tradition, a call of outrage that this shouldn't occur. But it was a lack of sensitivity to the problem. You didn't associate socially between the races. The churches were segregated, and I think generally still are today. And the African American church was a rich experience, not in terms of overall opportunity, but the church was, as I observed it, a supportive, nourishing location where an African American could go. And so an impediment was just the lack of sensitivity, the fear of economic reprisal if you were a restaurant owner. And of course that was broken by Chancellor Murphy, Wilt Chamberlain, Fog Allen bringing Wilt Chamberlain here. And those years predated the famous national title basketball game between North Carolina and KU was held in 1958 in the Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City. And the game went into 3 overtimes, and North Carolina won the national championship. Kansas lost. And Wilt then played 57, 58. So the restaurants began to open up. But where would you spend the night if you were traveling? And there was just this sensitivity. Why? Am I going to be the first one, a white owner? Am I going to lose money? And then, since there was no social mixing, you didn't get to know somebody from the other race. And as slowly as that changed with the Civil Rights Act, with the ability, the natural ability, when it was given an opportunity to blossom, if it was in debate or in chemistry or in literature, on the athletic field, then students began to associate But I think I've never taken any particular pride in, Lawrence was I don't think it stood out. I think now it pumps its chest a little bit when it ought to go back to the history book and see that discrimination was the order of the day here until the 60s, although school segregation was not an issue.
Right. One of the things that is impressive about Lawrence, when you look back at that period, is that there were a fair number of citizens, kind of at the grassroots level, forming groups like the League for the Promotion of Democracy, the United Church Women, the Fair Housing Coordinating Committee, who were trying to tackle some of these problems. What do you think motivated some people to step up and try to address some of these forms of discrimination, including the fair housing issue?
I think it was their background. They had come to Lawrence. They were predominantly, I would say, connected with the university. They had income adequate to put food on their table. They were well educated. They had housing themselves. If they had tenure at the university, they had security and employment. If they didn't have tenure, they were within a friendly community. And I think then, as the university began to grow, we noticed in Lawrence, and in my opinion, one of the really positive developments was the development of the Jewish Community Center. Because with the development of a Jewish presence in Lawrence, there was, I think, a certain buoyancy added to the arts, to equal opportunity in all areas of life, and the recognition of discrimination against Native Americans as well began to be taken notice of. And I know the individuals who, for example, at the swimming pool, that was a group led by folks associated with the university. And after Franklin Murphy talked to as reported, to the restaurant owners and said, you open up for everybody or I'll open a restaurant on the campus. And the group began to form. It took a lot of leadership and initiative. But the individual business person who had a family and depended, or the lawyer who practiced law, who came in the door the next day. You didn't have a paycheck in the mail. And so I have thought that fortunately we were in a university community, and I think that would be borne out in Iowa City, Boulder, Colorado, Stillwater, Oklahoma, Lincoln, Nebraska. The university is an interchange of ideas. People come and speak, and then they bring their values from elsewhere. So they came from New England and from large cities and said, hey, this isn't fair. Then we began also to observe intermarriage among the races. And I think it was, I'm guessing at a date, 1967, when the United States Supreme Court struck down the Virginia miscegenation law. Mm-hmm. I mean, think of that, 1967.
Right. Yeah, it's
so
not that long ago, really.
No.
Were you personally involved in any of those types of organizations before? I know you interacted with them certainly when you became a member of the Human Relations Commission, but did you have any involvement with them before that?
No, let's look at them. Church Women United, I wouldn't have been
Right.
eligible for. League of Women Voters, I was never a member there, although they do permit men. I had not heard of Richard Dooland and that group. You may have a note there on the group that picketed the swimming pool.
The Lawrence League for the Promotion of Democracy helped to
Yeah.
coordinate that
Yeah,
effort.
no.
How about through your church? Some of the churches I know were very involved in.
Yes, church leaders were involved, and there were, I think, 22 churches that lined up, and Plymouth Church has, through its history, always been a leader in the equal opportunity, open doors for all citizens. But no, I was not a member myself.
Okay, as you became a member of the Human Relations Commission, did you come on board with any particular concerns about specific aspects of discrimination, or did you have any personal goals of things you wanted to accomplish, or were you just looking to make whatever kind of contribution that you could make to the group?
Oh, no, I joined it as one to be educated. I didn't, I felt housing was, we shouldn't tolerate the current situation. But I had, in reviewing the material, a news clipping I noticed I was quoted appeared before the city commission several times, maybe 3 times. And I was quoted in one, I don't independently remember this, but in rebuttal to a question, I said, according to that quote, I have a family, a wife, 2 children. I can decide where I want to live. I can decide when I want to make a move, when I want to sell a house, when I want to buy a house. And my skin is white. Why? Why does the skin make the difference? You know, the credit report, the sort of color of the credit report is relevant. Is your credit good if you're going to borrow money? But so my hope here is that everyone would have the opportunity I have. And it was obvious that it was unfair. But I was not a individual crusader out marching in the streets and leading, carrying signs or anything like that. I certainly don't want to claim any, any shining armor of now, 50 years later, for what I didn't do. I was hoping to get my mortgage paid. But I do think that once the business community saw, once Mike Ghetto testified as the manager and owner of the hotel, well, let's open this up. And of course he had to by 67 because of the fair housing, because of the equal public accommodations and Civil Rights Act.
Right. I know the commission had already had a committee or a subcommittee that was looking at housing issues even before you all took up the proposal for an ordinance. So obviously that was something of interest and of concern to the commission. Did they have prior involvement with organizations like the Fair Housing Coordinating Committee that you're aware of? Were they coordinating their efforts or sharing information?
I don't have an independent, I can't say the date or the time, but looking at the record, the minutes and my correspondence, for example, in February of 1967, the Lawrence Journal-World ran a series of articles, one right after another in early February. The first one was written by the Human Relations Commission. And the opening sentence of that article was, the title of the article, the headline was Commission created to look at housing in Lawrence. And the opening line was, Mayor John Weatherwax was asked in 1960, if he'd have been asked in 1960 if Lawrence had a race problem, he would have said no. But if I, that is the mayor, was asked today, 1966, I would say yes. And that article went on to document where African Americans had been restricted. So we'd been studying that, working with the NAACP. The second article was written by the NAACP. The third article by E. Jackson Bauer, who was a professor of sociology at KU, looking at segregated housing from a sociologist's viewpoint. The fourth article by Bob Kazad of the KU Law School, writing about Brown versus the Board of Education, that education was up, but not housing. And the last one by R. Reinhold Schmidt Jr., a Reverend Presbyterian minister who was on the faculty of the KU School of Religion. And he wrote about how open housing opportunities would benefit other areas of one's life in the community. So we were hearing of these examples. And of course, two members of the commission, Mrs. Wallace and Mr. Spearman, were African Americans. And so they were echoing or talking about the difficulties of housing. But I don't have, I haven't refreshed my memory about the minutes in 1964. I limited it to some in 65, 66, but primarily 67. But when we started after that January 4, 1967 meeting and resolved to draft an ordinance, we really went to work on it in earnest.
Do you recall I believe it was in June of 66, you wrote a memo to, I think it was William Benz, who I think then was still the chairman of the Human Relations Commission, and you told him that you had reached out to the Real Estate Association to try and meet to talk about fair housing issues, and reading between the lines, you basically said they kind of rebuffed me. They weren't particularly interested in sitting down unless we had some very specific things to talk about, and they didn't want to just talk generally about real estate practices. Do you recall what led to you making that effort? And
Well, I have the letter in my file, and I've read it a couple of times recently. Bill Benz was chairman, and he obviously asked me to make the contact because he was at the faculty. I was practicing law here, and I worked with the Realtors. Our firm worked with the Realtors week in, week out with somebody on the Realtor board. And I wrote the letter to Bill Womack, probably because he was appointed by the Realtors along with another Realtor, Ken Vineyard, to be a subcommittee. And according to my letter, we had, as a commission, met with them sometime earlier. And so we hadn't heard anything more from them, and this was outreach on our part, saying, because we're now gearing up for this to get ready to the next year or moving into the ordinance, and can't we meet and work out some specifics? And we were hoping to sit down and see what their real complaints were, what their feelings were, and see if by some accommodation we could work with them. And then that was a phone call. My letter memorializes the phone conversation. And he said, well, what do you want to talk about specifically? We've already met with you once. Well, that's a legitimate point of view. And I said, well, I don't have any specific. We just wondered if we couldn't get together again. And he said, well, it's a busy time of year for us. And Ken Vineyard and I, if you have something specific you want to talk about, why, let us know what the specifics are, but we don't want to take the time now just to have another meeting. And having the advantage now of many years on many committees and many meetings, I think it's, well, if you're going to meet, to have an agenda.
Right.
So I think that was the background. And so I was reporting to the chairman, and I like to record phone conversations right after. I don't mean record them for audio, but I mean get the letter out to memorialize them so that the record is there. And with the passage of time, you don't forget what was said and so forth.
Yeah. Jumping ahead a little bit to the period when you were actually drafting the ordinance, was there any interaction then with the real estate community as you all were drafting it to try and get input from them or thoughts from them, or did you just
No, I don't recall any. Well, Glenn Kappelman
was
a member of the commission, and he was a really, really fine person. He had a successful real estate practice. He was trusted. The university community, when a new member would be coming to the law faculty or to political science, somebody in the department would be on the phone with the new and say, hey, you're going to need a realtor, look up Glenn Kappelman. And he was, his name defined integrity, honesty, fair dealing. And so we had an input into the community, and he and I would talk, and I don't remember anything specifically, but we'd run things by him, and with that sort of turn down from our invitation, we just proceeded.
Right. So obviously, as you've mentioned, you played or as the record shows, you played kind of the key central role in drafting the ordinance, and I know you used things like the Iowa City and other cities' ordinances as a model. How did you end up with that responsibility? And who do you recall collaborated with you on that effort?
Mrs. Keltz, Dorothy Keltz, was chairman of the Housing Subcommittee. I refreshed my memory from the minutes on that, and she made a call to a gentleman in Iowa City who was on their Human Relations Commission, and talked with him. I don't remember why I was asked. I presume because I was the only attorney member of the commission, and I had worked, I'd been an assistant attorney general, and then while I was the early months of practice in Lawrence, private practice, I continued working for the reviser of statutes in Topeka, helping draft legislation for legislators, and I'd work over there on the weekends, which as a young struggling lawyer added a little a little change to my livelihood. So they probably thought the experience, and I had a secretary and I had an office, and then on help, I've talked with Professor Robert Cassad, Bob Cassad, who now resides up at Presbyterian Manor, and I believe you're going to interview him.
Yes, we are.
And he had some memory of copying some other ordinances. I had no independent recollection of that, but when I started through the files, I saw that he'd written one of the articles for the journal World, and I saw that he'd appeared on January 4th, 1967, and had spoken. So I called him back again and refreshed his memory. So when you interview him, he'll hopefully be aware of that.
Good.
So then when I ran across this little item that, as a commissioned item of authorizing me to reimburse him for $6 of copying expense, why, I knew that he'd copied, because there was no internet then, and you'd have to go to a statute book or an ordinance book of the city and find it and put it in a copier and copy it. Entirely different than you do today. You just go online and boom, you'd have it today. So I have no independent memory of, but it's bolstered, my recall's bolstered by the record, refreshed. On the actual language, I think I noticed that the city commission asked questions. For example, Mayor Rainey asked about the definition of race, gender, etc., and creed. What does creed mean? That came up when we made our presentation. So then I went back and prepared memoranda and suggested that we look to the state of Kansas, which has a definition for discriminatory practice, and take creed out. And any time the Kansas Supreme Court were to interpret the state law, it would be helpful because our definition would be the same. Well, that's lawyering. I mean, that's the kind of thing a lawyer is trained to do. But I was working with Mrs. Keltz, Glenn Kappelman, and bringing these drafts up to the commission itself in March and early April, February, March, and early April. And then the subcommittee had a draft to recommend. The commission went along with it. And then each commissioner, I remember just by looking at the record, that there were several questions from the commission indicating that they had read it carefully when we first presented it. And then we presented a flow chart so that if we had the opening introduction for our ordinance, they could refer to other cities. And we listed 53 cities and 18 states. And the idea was to try to be efficacious and persuasive so that the commissioners could go across and see that we weren't doing anything. We wanted them to have a comfort level. And if we could give them a comfort level, then they would not be out all alone doing something no other city had done.
Right. That leads me to my next question, actually. I was going to ask if you all had kind of strategized before you formally presented the ordinance to the city commission as to how you would present it in ways that would make them more comfortable with it or more receptive. And did you feel pretty confident right from the beginning that this ordinance would pass?
I don't have a memory of a feeling of confidence. I have a memory of a feeling of energized commitment, which personally I was energized as Ship Winter became interested and energized, and Glenn Kappelman and Mrs. Wallace and Reverend Stephan and Jim Owens, and we all supported each other. We respected each other. And I think we felt we had a good team and a good presentation, and that we would be successful. I think we had a feeling that the Realtors, the Realty Board, the time had passed them by. And they were the only opponents. There was no landlords association or I don't know who might have been an opponent, homeowners association. And I mentioned, I haven't mentioned today, but the ordinance, we drafted it and the city commission took notice of this so that it didn't apply to a church. If a church owned a house and rented it, they could rent to whomever. They could to your own home if you had, I think, 4 or fewer rooms. In other words, you and your wife could have a large home and you could rent rooms to students and you could rent up to 4 rooms, and the ordinance didn't apply, or it didn't apply to duplexes. But now if you had a large home and you had 6 rooms renting out, then the reasoning was now you're really operating a housing business.
Right.
So we had the argument, of course, with a rhetorical question, where's the rub? I mean, what's the problem with this? The ordinance then passed with 5 on the commission, 4-1.
Do you recall when the commission held hearings, they held separate hearings for the proponents appeared at one and the opponents at another one? Was that kind of a standard practice, or was it merely a time management thing, or was there some reason they didn't want the opponents and the proponents appearing at the same time?
No, I think it was good use of the commission's time. They had regular Tuesday commission meetings, so they put it on the agenda, put the ordinance on the agenda with wide publicity. And the first time they would listen, they had other business as well. These were not separate commission hearings just for fair housing.
Okay.
Fair housing was the dominant item on the agenda, but there were honoring somebody for this day or that day, recognizing the Cub Scouts, all the things that the city commission does. And then they'd come to item 2 or 9 or whatever it was, and they'd have the proponents. And then the next week, they had the opponents. And I noticed in reading the press reports that the Realtor Spokesman not their lawyer, but their spokesman, said that he really wasn't as prepared as he'd like to be. And so the mayor said, well, we'll hold it over another week and you can have an opportunity fully to voice your objections. And then that occurred along in the next week along in late June, early July. And then the opponents raised questions on vagueness, First Amendment, interference with the right of contract. And so then the city gave us the opportunity to rebuttal. And we came back the third time. And as I recall, they opened it up then if anybody had anything else to say in opposition as well. But that third time, according to the press reports, and I've noticed I prepared written submissions in rebuttal on those points for each commissioner. And then it was put on what's called first reading, and that maybe was early July. And then the mayor, Dick Rainey, signed it July the 20th, and it became the ordinance of the city.
Right. Could you elaborate on the 3 points of objection that the Realtors had, what the kind of the substance or the nature of those objections were?
Yes, first as to vagueness, there's a axiom tenet in the law that any law that has a criminal sanction, whether it be a fine, imprisonment, cannot be vague. It must be so specific that the one charged knows when embarking on that activity that it will be a violation. There cannot be ambiguity in, for example, take parking. When you mark no parking after sundown or no parking after 6 p.m., do you mean Central Standard Time or daylight time or what is sundown? So you say no parking after 8 p.m. And that's whatever, if it's 8 p.m. in the city of Lawrence and you're there after 8 p.m. and you get a ticket, you cannot go very far with the municipal judge saying that's vague. I didn't know when 8 p.m. was. But if you said no parking after sundown, there might be an argument, well, on Tuesday, on the 31st of May, was the sundown when you gave me. So that's vagueness. And the counter to that was to show that there were 53 cities and 18 states that had similar language, and discrimination was spelled out. And if you come to a point where the public good balances out the vagueness, the ordinance was structured so that if there was a complaint of a violation, it was investigated by our commission. And then it went to an arbitration to see if it couldn't be resolved. And then ultimately it went to the city attorney, who would take it into municipal court. I don't know, I would be interested in knowing if Lawrence ever had a case that went that far. I'm not aware of one. The argument about the first interference with contract was that you have a right to sell to whoever you wish to sell to. But there are, of course, limitations on one's right when it is balanced against the general good. Like mending with free speech, you don't have a right to yell. The standard canard on that is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater and say, well, that's free speech. So the right to contract is subject to limitation as well. And the overall public good of having open housing did not affect you economically. You didn't have to sell to someone who had a poor credit rating. On the freedom of speech argument, I thought that was the weaker of the three, but it was simply that speech is broad. It isn't just oral speech, but it blends with my right to sell or to rent my property to whoever if you tell me I cannot rent to somebody, then that impinges on my overall individual right to express myself.
Okay. What do you think it was that ultimately swayed the city commission to pass the ordinance 4-1?
I think they were men of goodwill. They were they were successful individuals. One of them, Don Metzler, was a professor of engineering at KU. I didn't talk to any of them individually while this was pending. I didn't think that was appropriate or needed. I knew them all. I knew some. Dick Rainey was closer to my age, and so we were personally acquainted. I was aware of his sympathies towards equality for all because I'd heard him talk. I mean, just as friends talk. So I was pleased that he was the mayor, and I think if somebody wants to dish out some credit 50 years hence, why he's an individual that should receive a blue ribbon. But Jim Black was a builder. He was involved with the building community. Clark Morton had a building blocks company. They were, and I think the city, Mitt Allen was the city attorney. I think he was the son of Fog Allen and intimately involved with the basketball program. So I always thought, well, we had a friend and a sympathetic ear there. And I think it was, in Lawrence, generally it was an idea whose time had arrived. I don't think it was any great, for a minute, I don't think we persuaded any vote. I think we enabled. We gave them, they were coming to the table, and we just provided a meal that hopefully they found palatable.
That's a great way to put it. Do you recall, I think there was a press report, one of the articles in the Journal World in late June, described a meeting at John Emick's home between the city attorney, I think other city commissioners, in which there was discussion of modifying the ordinance to have fair housing complaints go directly to the city attorney rather than through the Human Relations Commission. Do you recall that meeting? Were you involved, and was that kind of an unusual thing, you think, to have kind of a private, closed meeting like that to discuss?
I'm not familiar with that story, nor was I involved in that meeting.
Okay.
And have no recollection at all of that. I'd be interested in reading that clipping if at some time you have it and I could, because you're telling me something I was not aware of.
Okay. Sure, we can take a look at that afterwards. I have 2 or 3 questions regarding the substance of the ordinance that Scott Wagner had wanted me to bring up with you. First of all, was the ordinance called for, besides potentially a $100 fine, up to 30 days in jail for a violation. Was that controversial? Did people view the potential of jail time? Although I know many of the other city ordinances had similar stipulations in it, but was there any pushback on that kind of that form of punishment?
Not that not that I recall at all. Nobody raised that question. I think that was, that was the end of the line, and it perhaps was discussed in the vagueness argument made by the attorney for the Realtors. The attorney was gentleman Don Holtz, who was a state senator from this district. And he was a fine man, and our law office was, right down the hall from his. So he may have alluded to that in his argument on vagueness, but I have no recollection of the penalty.
Okay. Do you recall why you all decided to include an anti-blockbusting clause in the Lawrence ordinance? Because that was not, some cities had that, but a small minority. Was there particular concerns that could be a problem in Lawrence, or was it just something you all added for thoroughness?
I respond to that this way. I have had no recollection of that before embarking on reading through all the material of 50 years ago. And I did come across, of course, our flow chart and my remarks to the City Commission that the blockbusting ordinance was taken from Wichita.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably said that, telling them where it was from, so it would, they'd say, oh, well, if Wichita has, but blockbusting was in the news then, and you may have seen the movie or the play Raisin in the Sun. The Theater Lawrence put that on last year, and then a sequel to it, kind of a fascinating group of characters 50 years later in the same Chicago area. But blockbusting was a term that, and I'm just trying to put some reason to it now, but no independent recollection. I can't tell you we said, oh, we need a blockbusting. That since that was part of the fabric of open housing, we reached out, saw that Wichita had it, and put it in.
Okay. Kind of in the introduction to the ordinance, there was a statement that says, the city of Lawrence is a center of culture whose democratic principles are being constantly observed by foreign students and visitors from all over the world. Do you recall who added that and why it was added?
No, I'll give you a couple of places, maybe a couple of thoughts. Lawrence had the ordinance creating the Human Relations Commission, and that ordinance became law in 1961 and was signed by Mayor Dr. Ted Kennedy. And it may be that was the prologue, that was some language from the ordinance creating the Human Relations Commission. The second thought on that language is that on January 4, 1967, during this crowded meeting of the Human Relations Commission, when we had 56 observers, one of them was a lady, I think Louise Lane, who spoke about working with foreign student families and graduate student families and foreign faculty families, and trying, when someone would come who was from Africa or from a geographical location where the indigenous population was other than white, coming to the university, and she'd encountered a difficulty, and she was sharing with us her difficulty in working with those groups, trying to explain to them why you just couldn't go in and move in and so forth. So it might have tied to that experience, or it might have just been a little self-polish that I think every city that makes a proclamation probably starts out about, the sort of boosterism that goes on with a whereas such and such and whereas such and such.
Right. I just wondered if it might have come from some influence of the university, because I know if you read and you probably have, the letter that Vice Chancellor Surface sent in support of the Fair Housing Ordinance and the Ted Owens, which you read the other night, both of them talked about, concern for Lawrence's image in attempting to recruit foreign students, recruit diverse faculty, recruit basketball players. And so that kind of falls into that category of being concerned about what Lawrence's image is.
I was not aware of Vice Chancellor Surface's letter. I'm sure I saw it 50 years ago, but it wasn't in the packet of what I did is about 5 years ago, the Spencer Research Library at KU contacted me and had an interest in my papers, files. So I spent a summer after I retired sanitizing and making sure that there was no confidence that would be revealed. And included in that group was my file as Secretary of the Fair Housing Commission. And so I turned that over to the Spencer. And so what I had, due to the gracious acts of Scott Wagner, who went up and copied my file and then presented it to me, and that's what I've reviewed. And in there I didn't see the Surface letter, but that would have been certainly in the kit or the brochure that we presented to the city.
Right. You've already mentioned Dick Rainey having played kind of a key role in the passage of the ordinance. Were there any other specific individuals who really stand out in your mind now that kind of played prominent or important roles in making this bringing this to fruition?
I think Glenn Kappelman, being a realtor with a prominent firm, Calvin, Eddy, and Kappelman, and I'm just reading between the lines, but if I'd been a city commissioner and I see Glenn Kappelman there, a realtor, successful realtor that doesn't have any problem with his ordinance, I think his presence was helpful. And again, I mentioned Jim Owens, Mike Ghetto, and Chip Winter appearing, and they would be maybe going to Rotary the next day, and certain city commissioners would be Rotarians or be in the Kiwanis or be in a church group or something, and Mrs. Wallace, the chairman of the commission, was so well spoken and I think well thought of. I'd have to mention Mrs. Kelts was prominent in the community as well. She grew up in Lawrence. Her father was Mr. Cohen, that had the long-time refuge, or we called it the junkyard, and as a Boy Scout, our troop used to go down there and sell paper during World War II. We'd collect newspapers and take them down to Mr. Cohen and Mr. Cohen's staff. So the Keltz family, Mr. Keltz was in business here. He had a business on Massachusetts Street. And she was active in mental health and in things like the food bank. She was just a prominent individual. And then the Williams tie-in with the university and with the community generally, and with the city, because at that time, above the city hall on the top floor, that's where the Williams boys had their office, because their father had been the chauffeur for Mrs. Elizabeth Watkins. And while their father was a student at KU. And then when Mrs. Watkins inherited all her wealth, Mr. Williams was her farm manager and executor of her estate. And part of the agreement with the city was to have their office. So the Williams folks were right above or where the city commission was meeting.
Right. Do you have a sense at the time that the ordinance was being considered by the commission, and then once it was passed, that there was fairly broad-based community support for the measure?
I would think so. I don't. I'm persuaded by the exhibit you had Monday night, or Scott Wagner did, of the photocopies of 986 names in the paper. That's pretty persuasive.
Right.
And then another 100 on another ad that didn't get in time. And what I don't recall is any arbitrations or any complaints specifically that we dealt with. But I don't have any record to refresh my memory. I think it just, everybody went to work the next day, and that was it.
I know in the late 1960s and early 70s, following the passage of the Fair Housing Ordinance, there was some racial unrest in Lawrence, and some of it violent. But do you feel that the ordinance, along with the changing practices of the businesses and public accommodation, that over time, have you seen, and obviously we improvement needs to be continuous, but did you get a sense over time that Lawrence made important changes in eliminating discriminatory practices, and obviously the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act at the federal level played a role as well. But do you feel like the community made substantive, observable changes that you felt reflected well in the community over time?
The changes were made, and my anecdotal observation, they were precipitated primarily by the quality and ability of black athletes and the support of the university for the athletic program. I think when assistant coaches were hired who were African Americans, and their salaries were published, and they were, in relation to others in Lawrence, rather robust. They were purchasing housing, I think, anywhere they wanted to. And then Danny Manning father was hired as an assistant coach. Danny came to Lawrence High School, and he was a popular student and, of course, an exemplary athlete, individual. Now he's a head coach at Wake Forest. I think another influence that ought to be mentioned hasn't so far. The name just occurred to me, and that would be Bob Billings, now deceased. We have a parkway named after him. But Bob Billings was contemporary of Wilt Chamberlain's and played basketball for KU. He grew up in Russell, Kansas, and he was a preeminent business person here. He developed Albemarle Golf Course, Albemarle Homes, Albemarle Tennis Center, contributed to the university, and was just an open-hearted, gracious individual who would not tolerate for one split second any arbitrary exclusion on the basis of one's race or religion. And I think his influence was significant. I can't evaluate or measure what our work did. Some observer who studied the situation could be more objective about that. I hope our work permitted some African American family or some minority family to have an opportunity that they might not otherwise have had. But I think the Chancellor Murphy, the surface letter, by 1967, Dr. Murphy had gone on from here, because he left here in about, I'd say 1960, and went out to UCLA as president there. And Dr. Wesco came as chancellor, who would have had the same feeling about university and equal opportunity for all its students. But I'm glad I thought of Bob Billings in this context.
Good. As you've mentioned, you were in 1987 appointed to the Kansas Court of Appeals, and a year later to a seat as a justice on the Kansas Supreme Court. Would you say your experiences on the Human Relations Commission and in seeking to address civil rights issues in Lawrence in the 1960s in any way influenced your judicial perspectives?
Issues of race per se, in the years that I was on the state Supreme Court, would have been federal issues. They would have gone through HUD or up through the federal Civil Rights Act, Public Accommodations Act. I don't recall any housing case that the court considered while I was on the court. I do recall from reading cases in the past, an early Kansas Supreme Court case, maybe back in the 1920s, which might have been out of Pittsburgh, Kansas, that had to do with employment, maybe by a school board. I'm a little vague here. It might have been a gender discrimination. But but then the associations that one has wherever you are have some effect on your personality and your thinking. And I think like osmosis, just you can't tell when it comes in or when it comes out of what makes up your thinking or your perspective on applying the facts of the case and the law, because that's what judges are to do, not their own personal viewpoint, what they think, how it ought to be decided. But what makes you an individual is really all of the associations you've had through your lifetime leading to the bench. And I remember specifically a meeting on housing held in Manhattan at Kansas State University. And Mrs. Wallace and I were delegates from our commission. So I said to her, May Zelma, we were on a first name basis, why don't I come by and pick you up and we'll go over. And I remember picking her up and how lovely she looked and how well she spoke and how proud I was of her being a colleague in Lawrence. She had some part of the program and there were people from all over the state. And so that type of association, I couldn't identify a time or a moment, but I certainly had a point of view of equality for all. But I think that was with me early on from my parents. We had no. Yet, having said that, again, I've referred earlier in my remarks, why wasn't I in the principal's office at Lawrence High School demanding that blacks be permitted to play basketball? And I can't answer that. It was just a lack of sensitivity.
And reflecting back now on the role you played on the Human Relations Commission, what would you say you were most proud of?
Well, I think the work on the housing ordinance, and the work the commission did in preparing it. Also the work sort of arbitrating through the swimming pool crisis, but the housing ordinance would stand out.
In thinking back on that time frame in your life and on what was going on, and not only in Lawrence but in the country, what do you think we can do today to kind of instill in young people an understanding and appreciation for that time, and an appreciation for how important the struggle of African Americans to achieve equality really was, and how that legacy can be carried over today in struggles that we're still facing in other areas of inequality?
I have some views on that. I think the city of Lawrence, the churches united, the Chamber of Commerce, the economic development, needs to look at minority families and single parent families. I have 4 grandchildren. If they need to go to soccer practice, we don't have any trouble getting them there. They have 2 parents, and I'm around, although I'm seldom called on. But we need to give children opportunities so that the working mother with 3 children How is she going to get the child to an enrichment program at 7:30 in the evening at the library? The law faculty professor and her husband, they say, okay, Sadie, we're going to go down to a special reading program. Hurry up and finish dinner. Jump in the car and away we go. But that single mother in a minority family, maybe one of the children is a toddler, who's going to be at home while she drives. And I think a community really could stand out in America if it formed a commission of credible individuals from various sectors of the community. That the committee had gravitas. When it spoke, it had people that would be taken notice. And that community came through with grants. Can we write grants? Can we get money? Can we provide the elderly can call and get transportation. What about the toddlers? What about the parents of the toddlers? Because to me, the root is education and opportunity. And you're not going to be a first chair clarinetist if you don't have the opportunity to get to the lessons. And sure, the school, when you get to middle school, the school will give you a clarinet or whatever you want, but it takes more than that. So that is my thought, to give opportunity to the children of Lawrence through implementing the opportunity. You can build a rock chalk park and a recreation center, but if the minority children can't get to it, or the low income. Monday night at the meeting you and I attended, one of the audience raised a question about affordable housing, who was a disabled woman, paid $850 a month rent and had a total check a month of $1,250 or something. Well, that opened my eyes to affordable housing. And I understand the city's working on that, but if we don't have affordable housing, then the children growing up don't have that opportunity. So education and the opportunity for education and enrichment of arts, sport, gives the child confidence, brings all children together, they grow, and that would be my answer.
Great. Well, Justice Six, thank you very much. This was a wonderful opportunity to sit down with you and have you answer a lot of questions, and we went for quite some time, but I think it was quite worthwhile, and I appreciate your perspectives.
Thank you.